When I first signed up for this class, I wasn't sure what to expect. Um, I liked the title, the reference to parable and metaphor. It spoke to my English major self. Long ago in undergraduate school, I majored in English and went on to get a master's and a PhD, so that part was appealing. Um, I looked forward to the spiritual and biblical connections we would make, and I have not been disappointed. I looked up the course description and saw that there would be a performance element, but that did not scare me the way it might some people. I know for most people, public speaking is high on the list of things that they would prefer not to do, but I've been teaching for decades, so public speaking isn't scary to me in that way. Before I was an English major, I was a theater major, and I performed in plays throughout all of my school years until grad school. And looking back, I realized I really only had bit parts. And I mention this because one of the surprises of this course was how much the memorization part made me very anxious. And even when we found out that there wouldn't be someone there checking word for word to see how many words we missed or messed up, I was still really worried about my ability to not only memorize but to be able to say it back. And I'm glad that I persevered because I learned a lot this semester. We began with the Robert Alter text, and that really spoke to my English major self. It's the kind of text I read a lot of in grad school, getting an MA and a PhD in English, and frankly haven't read a lot of that kind of text since. I have not been teaching in places that required me to continue to do research and publication in that way. So I have not been reading works of literary criticism. It was neat to remember that I do still like to read those kinds of works. That said, I'm glad we read it early because it did take a lot more focus than I would have had later in the semester. The Jensen text, Preaching Mark's Gospel, is much more familiar to the kinds, it's similar to the kinds of intellectual reading that I'm doing these days. I'm a synod-appointed minister, which means I get to preach and preside in one church, only one, even though I'm not ordained. I have permission from the bishop to help in that way. And so I've been preparing sermons each and every week. And so biblical commentary, like the Jensen text, is one that's familiar to me, although the Jensen text is really different in terms of the ways that it stitches stories together and the ways that it looks at connections across the book of Mark, particularly with the parable of the seeds. That was interesting. Francis Wade's biblical fracking felt the most fresh to me, but in some ways it reminded me of some of the poems that I've written. I've always liked looking at the minor characters. I've always liked looking at stories that exist already from a different perspective. So, for example, the last 10 years, I've been writing a series of poems about Noah's wife. Yes, Noah, the one that had an ark. And most of them, though, are set in modern times. And it gives me a great way to talk about issues like, say, climate change. So, for example, here's the first stanza of a poem I wrote, Higher Ground. On the last day of the year, Noah's wife waits for the insurance adjuster. She thinks of the Christmas flood and the larger flood before it. Now, you may be wondering why I didn't include one of my own poems as part of the story stitching instead of the one by Danielle Coffin. And the reason for that is that I didn't have anything already written that would make a good third text. And I thought about writing something for it and played around with some ideas, but then I came across the poem that I used by Danielle Coffin, and it seemed perfect. I chose my anchor story, The Bleeding Woman, because I had a vision of how I would perform it, how I would tell it. And in fact, when I made the discussion post saying that was the one I chose, I had this moment of anxiety thinking other people might have beaten me to it and chosen that story. Silly me. I didn't need to worry. And that is, in fact, a life lesson I continue to learn. Many of the things I worry about are not things that I really needed to worry at all. I chose the version in Luke, not Mark, because Luke felt more familiar, and if we're being honest, because Luke was a little bit shorter. And I looked through the Jensen book to see if Jensen had anything to add to my understanding, but that was not one of the stories that he explored deeply. Similarly, the altar text, with its focus on the Old Testament, didn't have much to offer in terms of interpreting the story about the bleeding woman. And I did find it interesting, that deep dive into how Old Testament writers structured their stories, but it didn't help me much with understanding just the one story in the New Testament. And the bleeding woman was not one of the stories that Wade chose to demonstrate his idea of biblical fracking. The Jensen text didn't have much to offer in ways of understanding the one text, but it did help me see the way of story stitching, especially tracing through Mark the idea of the parable of the sower. And in terms of my own story stitching, I was thinking about women in the Bible, wanting to stitch together 3 stories that focused on women. I thought about Elizabeth immediately. It was an interesting contrast between a woman who bleeds too much and a woman, Elizabeth, who was beyond bleeding but who could still produce life in her womb, specifically John the Baptist. Robert Alter might have suggested that I was doing something interesting with contradictions, like he talked about in chapter 7, and indeed I was. I kept thinking about blood. I kept thinking about the blood of the lamb, but again, I wanted to focus on women. I thought about bleeding and wombs, and that led me back to the story of Eve. And when I was young, I was taught that Eve brought the whole idea on us that women have to be punished for her transgression, and one of the ways we're punished is by having to endure a lifetime of menstruation. So that seemed like a good way to go. I thought about creating a brand new story with Eve, maybe something through the viewpoint of the apple, the way that Wade might suggest that I do something on the margin, maybe a story from the voice of the tree. But in the end, the coffin poem worked. It was already created. It was good to go. So I chose that. I liked the stories because they revolved around stories of women and power and different approaches to that power. The bleeding woman in the anchor story is desperate, and Elizabeth seems more like she's come to terms with her barrenness. She's more passive, where the bleeding woman is more, take charge, seize the opportunity, and Eve is really different. I see her as wanting power, but in the way that many of us who go to school want power. We want the power that comes from knowledge, from being able to see for ourselves, make our own decisions, get as much information as we can. And each of the 3 stories can be seen as a desire not just for healing and not just for wholeness, but a world in where we can flourish. These stories about gender and power and healing and flourishing make me think of God in a different way than God is often presented to us, at least in these stories. We might see Eve as being punished for eating the apple, but we could also see her, or see her alternately, as being allowed to live in a world where she has more agency. That's what she said she wanted. She's not killed for her transgression, but instead is allowed to live on her own terms, to live more fully. Similarly, Jesus treats the bleeding woman with compassion and not anger at her impulsive move towards health and wholeness. And Elizabeth is a woman to remind us all that it's not too late, even if we think we've settled into old age. And that's a story of power that I need to hear again and again. I learned a lot about the stories by thinking about how different texts would work together or not work together, and I'm deeply appreciative of all the videos that were included with the class, all the examples of what we could do with biblical storytelling and story stitching. Putting the Christmas and Easter stories together was amazing. I've heard these stories my whole life, almost 60 years now, and not until seeing those 2 stitched together did I see similarities and make connections. And similarly, the chance to see the whole Gospel of Mark through our instructor doing biblical storytelling, wow. Here too, I saw connections that I never made before and wouldn't have made without seeing them performed that way. I've read the Gospel of Mark in one sitting, but didn't see what I saw in the performance. The way the disciples just never understand. The whole way through, they just do not understand. And it was interesting to watch Jesus slowly figure out who he is, what he's about. I had come across that idea before in books like the Jensen book, but seeing it performed really hit me in a more visceral way. And similarly, our discussion of the Syrophoenician woman and then seeing all the ways that different people approached the telling of that story, I felt like I got insight that wasn't necessarily in the original text. Some of the insight is similar to what Jensen said about it, and seeing it performed in all the different ways, very instructive. Like I said, I'm glad we did the altar text first, because in light of the New Testament work that we did, it didn't seem quite as relevant. And I'm also happy that we did it before I had so many papers to grade, in addition to seminary work, because I'm still teaching English. This class broadened my experience and my imagination of what a sermon could be. Most of my experiences of sermons have been, well, they're more like speeches, even lectures. They tell us what to think about a biblical text because the sermon writer has done hours of research. What a revelation to let Scripture speak for itself by way of a gifted storyteller. I'm also intrigued by how the experience of the storyteller or the storytelling changes the storyteller. And I'm still thinking about that. I don't have any deep insights yet, but I do feel that it has changed me to think about the stories in this way. And it makes me think about doing this kind of assignment in an English class. Not biblical storytelling, but I wonder what it would be like to modify this for a literature class. I haven't experimented with it yet, and I'm mentioning it here so that I will remember, because it's something that I want to try, a new approach that I think students would find fresh and interesting. So we'll see. The older I get, let me just say this in conclusion, the more grateful I am that of all the ways that God has found to speak to us. Maybe it's a burning bush. Maybe it's a yearning deep in our hearts that never goes away. Maybe it's Lectio Divina or deep Bible study. Maybe a traditional sermon series. Or maybe through the experience of biblical storytelling. And most likely it's a combination. One thing that I have learned through all my years, and I say this with the spirit of hope, is that God doesn't go away mad in a huff saying, well, if Kristin cancels on me one more time, I'm going to quit offering invitations to her. No, God will keep offering invitations. And biblical storytelling is one way to unplug our ears, one way to start paying attention. The stitching together of stories, another way of paying attention and seeing things in a new way, so that we can hear the invitations that God continues to offer. I am grateful, very grateful for all the insights that I've had as part of this class, grateful for the experiences, my own and my fellow students, and being able to be a part. It has been a wonderful adventure, and I am changed and happy for the change. So thank you. Thank you for this class, for all the ways that you bring biblical storytelling into the world, and thank you for all the ways that you have been an inspiration in an autumn of dislocation where I have desperately needed inspiration. This class has been something to count on, and I am grateful, 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 grateful.